When I told my daughter I was planning to marry a woman from the Philippines, she didn't say a word for a long moment. Then she said, "Dad, I'm coming there." Not congratulations, not careful questions, not words chosen to soften what she actually thought. Just those 4 words, delivered in the same tone she used when she was 12 years old and caught me trying to eat the last of her Halloween candy. She meant it too. 3 weeks later, Jen was standing in the Mactan arrivals hall with a carry-on bag and an expression I recognized, the same one her mother used to make right before she said something she'd been rehearsing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's not where this story starts. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years teaching secondary school mathematics in Victoria, British Columbia. The kind of career that ends with a modest pension, a coffee mug from the staff room, and a sudden surplus of time you're not entirely sure what to do with. My wife, Patricia, passed away from ovarian cancer in the winter of 2021. She was 59. We'd been married 34 years. Grief doesn't follow a schedule. People say it gets easier with time, and I suppose that's mostly true, but what they don't mention is how long it takes for quiet to stop feeling like a punishment. The house in James Bay was the same house. The street was the same street. The coffee maker ran at the same time every morning because I'd never changed the timer. Everything was exactly as it had been, except none of it was. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because it explains why on a Wednesday evening in February of 2023, I was sitting at my kitchen table scrolling through a Facebook group called Philippines Travel and Expat Life at 9:30 at night. I wasn't planning anything. I'd taken a solo trip to Southeast Asia the previous autumn. Just me, a backpack, and a loose itinerary, and spent 5 days in Cebu almost by accident. A missed connection in Manila had turned into an unexpected stay, and something about the city had followed me home when I left. The group was just a way of holding on to a feeling I couldn't fully name. I'd posted a photograph I'd taken from a jeepney window, just a street in the afternoon light, a woman selling mangoes from a cart, ordinary life caught between 2 buildings. Someone had commented that it looked like her neighborhood. Her name was Nora. I answered the comment. She replied, "That probably should have been the end of it." 2 strangers briefly agreeing that a photograph caught something true. But she asked a question about the neighborhood, and I answered, and by the time I noticed we'd been talking for 2 hours, we'd moved from the comment section to Messenger, and I'd already made a second cup of tea. I want to be honest about what those early conversations were and weren't. They weren't flirtatious. They weren't anything I would have called romantic for a long time. Nora was 49 years old, a registered nurse at a large public hospital in Cebu City, and she had the directness you sometimes find in people who've spent 20 years in hospital wards. She didn't perform. She asked what she wanted to know and answered what I asked without embellishment. We talked about Cebu most of the time at first. She told me which streets were worth walking and which weren't. I told her what had surprised me about the city. Gradually we drifted to other things. What we'd cooked for dinner, what we were reading. Small frustrations that felt significant in the moment. She had a patient who refused to take his medication unless the nurse on duty was someone he trusted, which meant she ended up covering shifts she hadn't planned. I had a neighbor whose dog barked at 6 in the morning without fail. Neither of these things mattered, but we talked about them, and that mattered more than I understood at the time. I remember an evening in March, still cold in Victoria, frost on the car in the mornings, when she sent me a voice note by accident instead of a text. She was laughing at something before she started speaking, something that had just happened, and she couldn't compose herself long enough to get through what she meant to say. I played it twice, not because I needed to hear the words, just because the sound of it was, I don't know how to explain it exactly. It was like something came back into the house that had been absent for a while. By April, I'd noticed I was telling her things I hadn't told anyone else, not big things, just the ordinary accumulation of a day. That's how I knew something had shifted. Not with a decision or a dramatic realization. Quietly, without permission, the way morning gets light before you notice it's happening. I didn't tell Jen until July. That was my mistake, and I knew it when I finally did. Not because the news was bad, but because waiting 4 months had made it seem like I'd been hiding something. When I called her, I said I'd been talking with someone, a woman in the Philippines, for a few months, and that things had become serious. Jen is a good person. She was steady and kind through her mother's illness in ways that would have broken most people. She manages a small architecture firm in Toronto and works 14-hour days without complaining. I'm proud of her in the way that catches me off guard, sometimes, the way it did when she was young, and I realized she was more capable than I'd given her credit for. She listened to everything I said. She asked a few careful questions. Then she asked one that wasn't careful at all. "Dad, how much have you sent her?" "Nothing," I said. "Has she asked you for anything?" "No." "Has she mentioned her family's finances, medical costs, anything like that?" I said no to all of it. There was a silence long enough that I started to wonder if the call had dropped. "Dad," she said, and I could hear her choosing her words, "I've read about this. I've read quite a bit about it, actually. There are specific patterns, and I love you, but I need you to understand that loneliness makes people, even smart, careful people, see what they want to see." She wasn't being cruel. That was the part that stayed with me. She was scared. She'd watched her mother die, and then she'd watched her father grow quieter and quieter in a house that used to have 2 people in it. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She was trying to do what she'd always done, protect what was left of us. But the word loneliness sat in my chest like something cold for a long time after that call ended. For the next 3 weeks, I didn't tell Nora about that conversation. Every time we talked, I convinced myself I'd bring it up next time. And then next time came and I couldn't do it. She hadn't changed. She was exactly who she'd always been. Still sending voice notes from the hospital parking lot during her break, still asking whether I'd eaten properly because she'd decided at some point that I probably didn't, still laughing before she finished her own sentences when something struck her as funny. There was nothing suspicious in any of it, and yet every time I ended a call and sat in the quiet of the kitchen, I could hear Jen's voice. There are specific patterns. I started reading things online. I'm not proud of that. I read stories about men who had lost savings, dignity, years. I read forums where people were very certain about what women from particular countries were and weren't capable of feeling. I read warnings written with enough authority that they sounded like established facts. After about a week of that, I made myself stop. Not because every warning was wrong, but because I realized I was doing something unfair. I was filtering everything through a conclusion I hadn't actually reached. That wasn't honest to me, and it certainly wasn't fair to Nora. So I started paying closer attention instead. Not suspiciously, just honestly. In 5 months, Nora had never once asked about my pension, my savings, or what I planned to do with the house in James Bay. She had asked about my knees because I'd mentioned they bothered me on the stairs in winter, and she'd sent me a link about physiotherapy exercises. She'd asked about Jen because I'd mentioned she lived in Toronto. She had never once hinted that she needed anything from me except the conversation itself. That didn't make Jen wrong for worrying, but it made me want to be honest. One evening I told Nora I needed to say something, and she said okay the way she always did, not alarmed, just present. I told her about Jen's reaction. I told her about the things I'd read, and I admitted that some of them had found their way into the back of my mind even when I didn't want them there. When I finished, there was a pause, not uncomfortable, just enough time for her to think. Then she said, "Has she met me?" "No," I said. "Has she ever spoken to me?" "No." "Then she's worried about the idea of me." She said it without any heat in her voice. I understand that. If my son told me he'd spent months talking to someone I'd never met on the other side of the world, I'd be worried too. That's not an insult. That's just a parent. I sat there not knowing what to say. You don't have to choose between what I've shown you and what she's afraid of, she said. But don't let her fear become your conclusion before you've had the chance to find out for yourself. That was the most reasonable thing anyone had said to me in months. I bought the ticket the following week. Vancouver to Manila, Manila to Cebu. 10 days in September. I told Jen I was going. She asked me to wait. I told her I'd been waiting long enough. The flight from Vancouver took the better part of a day with the layover. By the time I landed in Mactan, it was already evening, that thick, warm air meeting me through the terminal doors like something physical. I'd been to Cebu once before, but arriving with a reason to be there felt entirely different. I spotted Nora before she saw me. She was standing back from the crowd near the arrivals barrier, not holding a sign, not scanning faces with any particular urgency. She was just waiting in the unhurried way of someone who has learned that most things arrive eventually. When she saw me, she smiled. Not a performance, just a smile. The first thing she said was, "You look exactly like your photos." I told her that was probably the kindest thing anyone had said to me lately. She laughed, picked up the smaller of my 2 bags before I could object, and started toward the exit. That was how we met in person. No ceremony. Just 2 people who were relieved the other one was exactly who they'd hoped for. I want to tell you about something that happened on the 4th day, because I've thought about it more than almost anything else from that trip. We were at a small turo near her neighborhood, plastic stools, ceiling fans turning without much ambition, the smell of garlic rice and something frying. An elderly man came in alone and sat at the far end of the table. He had the look of someone who was used to eating with another person who was no longer there. Without saying anything, Nora caught the eye of the woman serving and spoke to her quietly in Cebuano. I have no idea what she said. The woman nodded. A few minutes later, the elderly man had food in front of him without having placed an order. Nora never mentioned it. We kept talking about something completely unrelated. She didn't look over to check if he'd noticed. She simply went back to whatever we'd been talking about, as though nothing had happened, because for her, nothing unusual had. But I noticed, and I remembered, because moments like that can't be rehearsed. They happen when someone has forgotten they might be observed, and what you see in those moments tells you more than a year of careful conversation ever could. Saying goodbye at the Mactan airport was harder than I'd expected. We'd both known the 10 days had an end, but knowing something and arriving at it are different experiences. We stood near the check-in counters talking about nothing in particular. The flight time, whether I'd sleep, the mangoes she'd packed for me that I was fairly certain weren't going to survive Canadian customs. Eventually I had to go. I hugged her, picked up my bag, and started walking. About 20 meters on, I looked back. She was still there, one hand raised. I carried that image across the Pacific and sat with it for a long time. Back in Victoria, the house was the same. The coffee timer ran at the same time. But something had settled in me that felt less like sadness and more like a question that had finally become one I was willing to answer honestly. I talked to my friend Jim about it. We'd taught together for 20 years at the same school, and Jim listens more than he speaks, which is rarer than people think. When I finished telling him about the trip, he just said, "So what are you going to do?" I told him I wasn't sure yet, that Nora had her work, her mother, her son in Manila, that I had the house, Jen, my own routines. "You're not actually asking me whether you should see her again," Jim said. "You've already decided that part." He was right, I had. Jen didn't know about the trip until I was already home. When I called her, she listened without interrupting. Then she was quiet for a moment. "I want to come and meet her," she said. Not an apology, not a concession, Just Jen, once she decided to do something, she went and did it. I told Nora. Her response was characteristic. Tell her to let me know if she has any dietary restrictions. Jen flew to Cebu in November. On Nora's suggestion, she arrived a day before I did, and I spent that day in Victoria wondering what they were saying to each other. When I landed and got to Nora's place, the two of them were sitting in the kitchen, Jen with a cup of coffee, Nora explaining something about a dish on the counter, both of them deep in a conversation that had clearly been going for a while and didn't need me to continue. That night, after Nora had gone to bed, Jen and I sat on the small porch out front. It was warm in a way that still caught me off guard. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, she asked me about Mum. I waited. Not in a strange way. She just wanted to know what she was like. She said she could tell a lot about a person from the way their family talks about them. Jen looked at her hands. She was kind about it. We sat there without talking. The neighborhood sounds carried through the dark. A television somewhere, dogs, someone's radio playing something faint and far away. I'm sorry I didn't trust you, Jen said finally. I thought I was protecting you. I think I was mostly just scared of losing you to something I couldn't see. I told her I understood that better than she probably knew. The practical side of everything that followed was not simple, and I won't pretend it was. I spent a long time on the phone with a financial advisor in Victoria who specialized in clients living overseas, figuring out what my provincial health coverage would and wouldn't do once I was spending extended time outside the country, what that meant for my pension income, how the costs compared. The house in James Bay needed decisions made about it. Jen needed honest conversations about what a father on the other side of the Pacific would and wouldn't mean for her. I didn't answer everything at once. Instead, I started spending 3 months at a time in Cebu, then 2 months back in Victoria. That rhythm held for about a year. It wasn't seamless. Logistics between countries at 63 are genuinely not romantic, but something was building inside it that I hadn't had in a long time. About 8 months into that arrangement, something happened that I'd been quietly nervous about since the beginning. I had a health scare one afternoon in Cebu. Chest tightness, some shortness of breath, the kind of thing that takes a man my age down a dark corridor of imagination very quickly. I was far from Jen, far from Jim, far from any hospital I'd ever been to before. Nora had me at the emergency department within 40 minutes. She knew the attending physician. She stood outside the room while tests were being run, not hovering, just present, and answered the questions I didn't know how to ask in a system I didn't understand. It turned out to be nothing serious. Blood pressure and dehydration and, she informed me with complete composure, too much salt in the Filipino food I'd been enthusiastically eating for months. But lying in that hospital bed afterward, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not relief exactly. Something quieter than that. Safe. Not saved. Just safe. The way you feel when someone who knows what they're doing is in the room and has chosen, without being asked, to be in your corner. Nora and I were married the following spring. Small, her family, Jen and Jim, who flew in from Victoria and spent most of the reception cheerfully trying to explain hockey to Nora's aunt. There wasn't a moment when everything suddenly felt different. It felt like what it was, the ordinary continuation of something that had been quietly becoming itself for a long time. Jen gave a toast. She talked about her mother, which I hadn't expected, and about the particular difficulty of watching someone you love learn to be happy again after loss. She said she'd been wrong about what that would look like. She said she was glad she'd been wrong. It took something for her to say that. I know my daughter. Someone asked me recently, a man in one of those same Facebook travel groups where this whole thing started, whether I had any regrets. He was 61, recently widowed, talking to a woman from Davao for 4 months. His children were worried. He was worried about being worried. I thought about it honestly before I answered, because the honest answer isn't simple. I miss Canadian winters. I know how that sounds. But there's something about February in Victoria. The gray light, the smell of rain on cedar, a Tim Hortons coffee you drink too fast because it's the only warm thing in arm's reach that I still carry with me. I miss Jen being a 45-minute flight away. I miss Jim, who I talk to every week but see twice a year if we're lucky. Every real choice costs you something. I knew that going in, and it's still true. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. But I also know what I told that man in the Facebook group. I told him what I'd learned. Not from the forums I'd read during those anxious weeks in Victoria. Not from warnings delivered by people who had never met Nora and never would. But from being here and actually living this. Pay attention to what she does, not what other people are afraid she'll do. Watch how she treats people when there's nothing in it for her. Notice what she talks about when she's not trying to impress you. Ask hard questions and listen to the answers without deciding them in advance. And once you've done all of that, make your own decision. Not your children's, not the internet's, yours. I'm writing this on the porch on a Tuesday morning. The bakery 2 streets over opened at 5, and I can smell it from here. Nora is at the hospital. She still works 4 days a week because she's 50 years old and she loves her work, and the idea of her stopping for my sake never made sense to either of us. Jen is visiting at the end of August. She's been here 4 times now. The last time she came, she and Nora spent a morning together in the market while I had a slow coffee at the place down the road, and when they got back, they were laughing about something that apparently started with a disagreement over mangoes and escalated from there. I never got the full story. I didn't need it. The people who warned me weren't wrong for worrying. I understand that better now than I did when I was defensive about it. Questions are reasonable. Questions are how careful people move through the world. But questions are supposed to lead you somewhere. They're supposed to lead you toward the person, toward seeing who she actually is, not away from her before you've even looked. The best thing I ever did wasn't moving here. It wasn't buying the ticket, or figuring out how to wire money internationally, or learning that the word for thank you is salamat, and that you should always say it twice. The best thing I ever did was refuse to let anyone else decide who Nora was before I'd had the chance to find out for myself.